Hello and most welcome to 670... 971. Thank you, Kalle. I'm getting too excited now when we are coming closer to the millennia. I was actually thinking that, could you have a look, Kalle, because I have the light in my back. Am I visible?
Yeah, you are a little bit in the dark.
Let's change here to be better sound waves here too. Any better?
You're still in the dark a little bit.
Let's see here. Yeah, you can sit down there. Sorry, Kalle.
Okay, please continue.
It seems to be light everywhere. We are in something called the House of Palms in the center of Gothenburg. And this was constructed from the model of the Victorian glass house in Kensington Gardens in London. The construction is from 1878. And actually, one of the palms is standing still to this day. And that's the one to the right. And as you can see, it's almost hitting the
Roof.
ceiling. This is bound to happen maybe within 2-3 years. And that will introduce some sort of finitude to the object of having this house of palms. When the palm hit the roof or the ceiling, that would be the end of it. Well, that is something that could be looked into. And someone who does that very effectively is Rodolphe Gasché. His book, The Tale of the Mirror, have gotten a lot of incredible criticism. For instance, the famed J.W. McInnes from Choice Literature Criticism writes a brilliant book that holds more for students of philosophy or literature than any other single work on Derrida. And he is from the magazine Choice. And we can also read a little abstract at the back of the book. I'm going to read that because it's so fitting. Deconstruction is no game of mirrors, revealing the text as a play of surface against surface. It is more radical philosophical effort is to get behind the mirror and question the very nature of reflection. The Tale of the Mirror explores that gritty surface without which no reflection would be possible. Gasché does what no one else has done before in many discussions of Derrida, namely to tie his work in an authoritative way to its origin in the history of criticism of reflexivity. Reflection is what the intellectual endeavor is about. So therefore the question of what is reflection is an incredibly important question. Because if we're not sure what we presume reflection to be, we will stand up in formidable problems. And this is the subject of this book, The Tale of the Mirror. It explores reflexivity. And you can also say, in Concord, what we've been talking about before, it also explores what is sameness or what is difference. And it tries to conclude that why go into oversimplification when it comes to sameness and difference. And the usual mode in Western metaphysical logocentrism is also usually to opt for a sameness that comes directly, this primitive sameness of identity. An identity that wasn't questioned until 1955, 1956, where we discovered in physics, yes, isn't it odd? The result comes from physics. When we realize that identity does not pertain to physics, mathematics, or any other scientific area. Identity is a construct, and this is the same identity that Rodolphe Gasché is trying to look into. Not criticize, but rather look into. There is a very slight difference, but it is an important one. Let me give you an example. We have earlier discussed the concept of the apeiron. And the apeiron is the fear of something that leads us to be in the ontic mood. I was discussing the apeiron a couple of weeks ago, and since we don't know what the apeiron is, it's more what we fear. I was just throwing out some suggestions of what it could be. And I said, maybe it's knowledge. I said it in a very neutral tone, just like it was a suggestion. And from two academic people, I got the direct answer, without thinking, no, the apeiron cannot be knowledge. And I was just shocked. It came so quickly. We don't know what the apeiron is. The apeiron means more or less literally the unknown, the thing that we don't know about. It could be anything, and we will never possibly know what it is. But preemptively, so quick, say that it couldn't be knowledge, that sort of stung me. And I thought that to be an answer that shut off all further discussion or thinking. And for me, that was plainly a defense mechanism. It was not thinking, because it shut the whole question off. It was not even directed to me. It was directed to the very idea that we could look into the apeiron and have open eyes and be open to what the apeiron could be. And that's, they say directly, no. That attitude is something that I was surprised by, but it's also an attitude that could be said to be the second subject of the book by Rodolphe Gasché. This is on a subjective level, usually in the book, that we shut out deeper understanding for what apeiron could be. And looking into the apeiron is most definitely a sort of reflection. And reflection is likewise a sort of apeiron. Because when I look into the mirror, what is behind the mirror is what I cannot see. I only see the reflection. That is immensely important. I only see the reflection. We discussed earlier that the idea of the reflection is what leads to the idea of origin. We start to thinking about the thing we cannot see, the thing that looks into the mirror. That becomes the subject in our head. And by going to the world of ideas in Plato's case, or looking for the arche as most of the pre-Socratics did, we really delve into a deepening of something we did not think about at the beginning. We just assumed it would be possible to reach an original presence, something that was not a copy. And that's one take on the mirror. I will have another take here on page 79 in the book, and the chapter is named Beyond Reflection, the interlacing of heterology. And let me explain here, because those are pretty difficult terms. Interlacing is very close to the nesting we mentioned earlier, where we spoke about Froebel and Husserl and Henri Bergson. Heterology is more or less a neologism by Rodolphe Gasché, but I heard it before. It means that it's not of the kind of being the same, homo. It is heter. And it is, of course, sameness here. It's pointing to sameness and all. So, let me start here. citing directly from page 79. Up to this point, I have discussed a mode of dealing with the aporias of reflection that still seem to prevail, in which a return to Hegel's speculative thought is seen as the only way to come to grips with the shortcomings of subjectivity. So what we want to escape is subjectivity. That's the method, so to speak, or the ideology of current knowledge. We need to go away from subjectivity. My opinion, for instance, I don't like this palm, it's sticky, it bothers me. I don't share that opinion with Kalle sitting a bit further away from the palm. So if I start with me not liking the palm, it doesn't really make any objective sense. So we need to go beyond the subjectivity. We can understand that teleology, we can understand that mission. Let us now turn to a different approach to the problems of self-consciousness and mutatis mutandis, absolute reflection. It is an approach that recognizes the previous ones as philosophically well-founded and recognizes as well the logical superiority of speculative thought over all attempts to criticize it in a reflexive mode from a position erroneously considered to be outside of it. And this is the assumption when we look into the mirror, we get, for some of us, get the idea that the thing looking into the mirror is outside of perception somehow. It is not present. So if I approach a mirror, I look into it, I don't feel, sense, perceive anything. I just see a reflection. Let us deconstruct that. I do sense some things. I have a proprioception. I have smell. I have hearing. Hearing is very important to locate my own body in front of the mirror. And I would even say that we have this kinesthetic sense of body map as well. All those things are actually present. So to think that the thing looking into the mirror is completely outside of reality could be looked into and to be shown to be problematic. It is not that simple. So you hear what Rodolphe Gasché is offering is not straightforward criticism. It is looking into the presuppositions of our thinking. And he doesn't have sure answers, but something that is very interesting is you often think when you read the book, I never thought about that before. And if I had not read it from the book of Rodolphe Gasché, I could have died before I thought it. And I would say that is one of the reasons this book is very important. We have one smart fellow coming from Luxembourg. It's a shame, the horrible sketch Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie made about the peace in Westphalia, that they deemed Luxembourg to be a worthless place and having as an only attraction one village food and a horse that could talk. This is a joke coming from a sketch where Luxembourg is pointed out that nobody wants to have in the peace of Westphalia. Interesting enough, this very position where I'm standing in now was very important in the peace of Westphalia. One could say the first stone was laid on what was to become Gothenburg in the end. So you see, everything is interlaced and connected.
Please repeat that. Well, Luxembourg, Gothenburg, what is the connection?
In the peace of Westphalia, the destiny or the fortune of Gothenburg was decided because how the peace was constructed.
Yes, yes.
So it started here. My saying was starting actually with a joke sketch. I would try to put in a link to the sketch here, and I would say in ordinary thinking would say that would be out of the point. That would be a complete outside. It could be something to make the hard chore of Kalle standing here next to me a little bit easier. Could also be directed to the ones seeing this YouTube clip, if there are any at all, to ease the atmosphere off. But this shows that there is an interlacing going on that makes even a senseless joke be a part of the interlacing, because it connects to the place where we're standing now. And I think this is a very good example of interlacing, and we cannot preemptively say, oh, that sketch should not be part of a lecture about something so serious as deconstruction. Quite the opposite, it should be here. But it's also a good joke, it's really funny. One of the few jokes where we have a historical Swede participating, I think it's De la Gardie, but he's carrying a blonde wig, and De la Gardie was never blonde, was anything but a blonde. He was of Belgian descent, it was pitch black hair. But this approach, I'm talking now about the complete outsideness of the thing looking into the mirror. But this approach also grants the possibility that the aporias of reflection, at least as far as the horizon of expectation of philosophy is concerned, are susceptible of being successfully overcome in absolute reflection, or in a modified speculative theory of discourse. So he's showing once more, he's repeating that in every chapter, there is a way. There is a way to have the cookie and still eat it. We don't have to disown reflection. And I would say we have disowned reflection because we haven't understand that there are possibilities. So it's incredibly hopeful book, because it shows a hope of having reflection once more, that it could be a possibility of thinking man to reflect on his own action, his own thinking, his own ideology, without falling into the trap of this idea of the thing looking into the mirror is completely outside. And the helping hand, so to speak, is of course interlacing and heterology. And heterology is exactly as I mentioned yesterday when we spoke about Susie Frobe. Heterology also makes possibility of sameness. But without heterology we cannot have sameness. So that is the very zest of it. So the earlier mistake of the idea of sameness was too crude, too primitive, and not sort of reflected upon. As I showed in the earliest example here, where the two academic people said directly no, that is shutting out of thinking. This is saying, here's a barrier. Thinking cannot go past that. If you do that, you end up undermining thinking itself, because thinking needs to be allowed to be free. It cannot have limits. Yes, other things can have limits. I'm not supposed to jump from this terrace here. I can't go through the roof. I cannot fly. I accept that. But thinking needs to be free, at least as free as possible. Because if it's not free, it loses its intellectual power. That is coming from the freedom. If we say preemptively that thinking has certain borders, we're taking away the energy of thinking. We are already saying what it can do. And that lineage or delimitation is random. This is one of the points of the book. The very randomness of pointing up borders makes everything about thinking after that to be happenstantial, to be completely serpentary. It could hit the goal, but we don't know preemptively. We don't know because we destroy the opportunity to really see what is beyond the mirror. Whether or not these would be definite solution is not really the question. Such an approach concedes that, within the limits of standards of philosophical problem solving, a common ground capable of superseding aporetical propositions can be found. This does not, of course, imply that success is taken for granted or left unquestioned. On the contrary, I shall question the very successfulness of successful philosophical solutions to the aporias of reflection. If Aristotle, discussing form as primary being, could state that to ask why something is itself, in Greek, ti αυτό estin αυτό, is to inquire into nothing, or not to inquire in the first place, then one can just as easily contend that to question the success of speculative solutions to reflexivity is not to question at all. And that's the same point I made earlier on, reformulated. When we say stop to thinking, we do something rather drastically. We stop every solution because complexity in itself is beneath the question. And then we say no actually to all kinds of knowledge, not just this one. Every kind of knowledge becomes an impossibility. So the point of Rodolphe Gasché is not that a certain amount of knowledge is being discarded. It is that all sorts of knowledge is coming under the line, so to speak, because complexity is what we are after, not the origin. The origin is belonging to this direct reflection and this rather primitive idea that is the thing that is looking into the mirror, doesn't have perception, it doesn't have intention, it doesn't have projection, it's a big no thing. It's outside of reality. It's exactly as Hugh Everett, thinking about transcendental worlds, or why not the Swede Max Tegmark, who's talking about otherworldly experiences we cannot have. That's exactly what he's saying. And he firmly believes in this. I would say Max Tegmark is making the very problematic decision to shut off knowledge. He says, there is a huge area in my knowledge which I can never ever know about, and I trust in that. That's a limitation, and I would say rather severe as such. From a traditional philosophical perspective, an approach of this sort makes no sense. Indeed, as we shall see, the approach I shall be concerned with escapes the norms and expectations classically associated with the discourse of philosophy. It is an approach that is attentive to a set of what one could call presuppositions. Presuppositions being in quotation marks. Presuppositions, or better yet, structures, which inform without philosophy's knowledge. Philosophy doesn't know, it gets informed. So we are talking about structures we were before not aware of. Maybe which we could, it's moving a bit, I think. Yeah, yes, could possibly be better. Its treatment of the problem of the aporetic nature of reflection and its possibly successful sublation by absolute reflection. So the solution he hints here to could be what he called absolute reflection. First, we must evoke yet another type of criticism directed against the philosophy of reflection, as well as against Hegel's speculative solution, a criticism from which the approach to be presented derives some of its major impulses. When, in the aftermath of Kant's transcendental solution to the problems of rationalism and empiricism, the tradition began by the Cartesian philosophy of subjectivity experienced a certain dampening. In an effort to avoid the aporias that such a philosophy carries with it, Hegel's radically immanent philosophy emerged as the major challenge to the philosophy of reflection. Yet, although Hegel attempted to overcome the reflexive aporias of the Cartesian and the Kantian paradigm of thought through a return to the Greek concepts of being and substance, this return took the form of a total subjectivization of these concepts. This is a thing we discussed many times before, and it's the absolute subjectivization that we find, at least in René Descartes, where he makes the world what he thinks for the moment. This is the momentary thinking that my subjective idea at this moment is the only knowledge I can have and nothing else. This, we will get back to later, is actually what pervades modern academia, that pure subjectivity is all what we can have, and that subjectivity is on top of that also momentarily. It's not something that lasts. For this reason, Hegel's philosophy must be viewed above all as a completion of the Cartesian thought. Therefore, although Hegel's immanent and, in his sense, non-reflexive philosophy can be seen as originating the type of criticism on which I shall elaborate, it also elicited this criticism as a reaction to itself. Fantastic coffee today, I might say. Myself.
Yes.
It's laced with cardamom.
Excellent.
You could say it's interlaced. I think that's a good point, actually. We have coffee flavor somewhere around, but we also have an interlacing of cardamom, and they seem to perfect each other.
We had a teacher a few months ago. We both read a course about pilgrimages.
Yes.
And this teacher said to us that entities are always absolute.
Okay.
It was so ridiculous.
But it's a trap to fall in. I made the same mistake. For at least 20 years I thought the same thing. But the thing is, it is something, as he writes there, it's a structure that is before philosophy. And then it could be very hard to discover. And even if someone else discovers, like you, Kalle, would have told it to me 20 years ago, I would have defended myself because I didn't know where in myself this absolute reflection is coming from. But he did something very incredible to my understanding. He was painting up the mirror and I could look into it myself. And by doing that, and this is also quite literally, earlier when I looked into a mirror, I always assumed somehow that the thing that was looking into the mirror wasn't there. And that's an easy mistake to do, especially if you're in a rush. But if you really sit down, you feel your own proprioception. you feel your own pretension, you feel your hand. So even if you can't see yourself, there is an interlacing of sensual perception. And of course I was aware of it. If you would have said to me, Hans, can't you feel your own body when you look in the mirror? And I would say, of course I can. But it's still something lingering on that we are non-substantial when we look into the mirror. And of course, I had to have some sort of weakness to fall for that. And I would say that weakness is our heritage of the amnesia, the ontic take. The ontic take make us not be able to go into time. And if you go into time, you will never ever make the mistake of thinking that the thing looking into the mirror doesn't exist in this world or have a certain kind of outsideness. And then you will do the mistake, as our lecturer did, to say that entities are absolute somehow. What that means, I don't know really, but I used to believe it. So maybe the pertinent question to me would have been in that time, Hans, what on earth do you mean by absolute? And I'm quite certain I wouldn't be able to answer that question. And I still to this day, I have a friend, I will approach him in the weeks coming. He says that numbers are absolute and they exist somewhere else. And they are non-created and they will never ever be created by anyone, but they still exist. So it's the same point of view that our dear lecturer had. And I will ask him, I will actually put the question to him and ask him, what on earth do you mean by existence? Because that has become much easier to me since Rodolphe Gasché's book. And I will pay a visit to Luxembourg. The country I never visited, and I will never ever criticize Luxembourg anymore. Well, I've never done it before, but I will not. Seems to be a nice place. Do they have wine? I don't know. No one knows. Let's continue. I'm going to repeat the last sentence because I made a sort of a digression here. For this reason, Hegel's philosophy must be viewed above all as the completion of Cartesian thought. Therefore, although Hegel's immanent, I could actually elaborate on immanent. Immanent, it means that it is in an extended now. It has the capacity to involve more than this momentary movement of count. And that has to do with his idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. His reflection takes in the opposing pairs and also the synthesis, and that's a broadening of time, so to speak. Whereas it's more immanent, it's longer. Whereas in the Kantian principle, you only have a very, very thin movement, actually non-visible. And of course also in Descartes. The Cartesian cut is very, very sharp. It doesn't make any place for immanence. It's not a now with a big now, it's a very small now. To make that a bit more clear. Because immanent, I don't think that's known by the listeners and the viewers. And in his sense, non-reflexive philosophy can be seen as originating the type of criticism on which I shall elaborate. It is also elicited this criticism as a reaction to itself, which is very important. Well, let's continue with the next paragraph on page 80, the last paragraph. I do not mean this to be a straightforward historical presentation of the antecedents of the approach now to be discussed, namely that of Jacques Derrida. Those landmarks can be found in philosophies of Nietzsche, Dilthey, and the later Husserl, and the early Heidegger. In short, in a type of philosophy that cannot comfortably be placed within the usual philosophical classifications. These are philosophies that unwind out of the philosophy of subjectivity. The critique of reflexivity and speculation enacted by these philosophies, which at their best house a philosophically irreducible and radical empiricism, unlike the philosophical doctrine of empiricism grounded in experience, and which can be easily accommodated by traditional philosophy as its non-philosophical other. It's quite harsh. Is pointing, of course, to analytical philosophy, amongst other things. Is mingled with much more traditional themes, and yet new and unwanted motives also make critique of reflection and self-consciousness, which places a necessary gap between knowledge on one hand and on the other hand self-cognition. What does that mean? Well, self-cognition is when I feel this poem to be bothering me, and that is usually deemed by standard philosophy to be utterly subjective and not part of philosophy. Rodolphe Gasché is exploring this area and looking into if that is really true. And I think I have to give you a hint, because I spent a lot of time with this book. It is not that easy, and since I spent like 3 weeks with just this chapter, I need to help you as well, because I couldn't understand it. Remember what I said earlier about time, that subjective and objective time becomes, in a way, one in fractal theory. That is important. So instead of giving up subjective experience, as traditional philosophy in the analytic realm has to do, doesn't have a choice, it has to do that to stay out of the abyss of subjective thinking. This is trying to show deeper underneath, before the presupposition, there can actually be a way. And that way is absolute reflection. And since it's a term coming from Hegel in the first place, he's using it in the Hegelian way in the beginning, Hegelian way. Take, for instance, Nietzsche's critique of reflection and self-consciousness. This is very important, and it's very, very good, which places a necessary gap between knowledge on the one hand and on the other hand self-cognition. Read the book Gay Science if you have the time. It is not one of the hardest works of Nietzsche. It could actually be read July evening in front of a glass of wine or something like that. It's not the tougher ones. You can easily understand what he's pointing to. He writes at the beginning on the genealogy of morals. We are unknown to ourselves. We men of knowledge, it's a cite from Nietzsche, and with good reason. We have never sought ourselves. How could it happen that we should ever find ourselves? End of quote. So we are necessarily strangers to ourselves. We do not comprehend ourselves. We have to misunderstand ourselves. For us, the law, each is furthest from himself, applies to all eternity. We are not men of knowledge with respect to ourselves. And that means that we, because of this, first we need to get rid of subjectivity. We end up in this conundrum, so to speak. By avoiding subjectivity, we make ourselves completely unknown. And we do make a limit preemptively. We can never ever go into ourselves. I can speak about myself second hand, and you can talk about myself third hand. But I can never go into myself. And my knowledge of the world necessarily have to be outside myself in some way. So you can see here how perception and reality itself constructs the problems. This is not coming from an ideology of Nietzsche. This is what he discovered from reality itself. And what is reality if not the mirror? Mirror is reality. It's not a presupposition, it is not an ideology, but it can still lead to mistakes. Isn't that interesting? Reality in itself can lead us astray. I would say that is the main point with the whole book. And I would say even that's the main part of deconstruction. But that could be... No, I think so. I really think so. The same motif can be said to underlie his autobiography, in which Nietzsche declares that to become what one is, one must avoid knowing oneself. Another cite from Nietzsche, where noscete ipsum would be the recipe for ruin, forgetting oneself, misunderstanding oneself, making oneself smaller, narrower, mediocre, become reason itself. End of cite. How aptly put. And this is not even a criticism, it's just how it was for Nietzsche, and for many of us before, and of course for our poor teacher. Self-reflection is seen in both cases as a flower of decadence and mundanity, as a phenomenon deriving from a primary state free of self-awareness, like a child, I would say, with respect to which self-consciousness is a falling away, yes, falling away, but is also seen as the necessary gap between oneself and one's knowledge, which breaks radically with the philosophical consecrated mode of accounting for the knowledge that one claims to possess by grounding it in self-consciousness and publicly accountable subject. So we have a problem here. We usually declare knowledge to be something that lingers within consciousness, and now we have a clash. The thing that David Hume said, he went into his consciousness to discover, Nietzsche reveals that not to be really holding grounds when it comes to empiricism or philosophy at large. So Nietzsche is not only revealing that there are major problems only with science, but also within thinking itself and knowledge itself. So it's a rather grim thing to understand, and no wonder the poor chap took his way into the loony bin. He ended up in a barmy house, being taken care by his mother his last miserable days of his life. One could say that Nietzsche did a sacrifice. He opened up his heart to complete understanding of where we stand, and therefore sacrificed the most precious that any human being can have, and that is his mind. Nothing can beat that, not even death. I think death would have been something much more merciful for Paul Nietzsche. And many people prefer that. And I would say, maybe Nietzsche would say that would be the coward way out. It's pretty tough-nosed to understand. Remember, I mentioned many years ago about the thermodynamics of the late 19th century, how they committed almost these mass suicides. They did that because they came to the same realization as Nietzsche did. They did it in mathematics and physics, that everything was terminable and knowledge itself was going to cease to exist. That's the second law of entropy. Everything that is order will go back to its original state of orderedness. And that's a pretty horrible prospect. But, as we will see if we go further to the book, that's a prospect that can actually be avoided, but only by going before. That's the only choice of avoiding it. Once we took that narrow perspective on ourselves that Nietzsche realized, once we say that the thing looking into the mirror is not of this world, then the problem is already started. That's why deconstruction is so incredibly important. Actually, I would say it's a lifesaver. Maybe it will save even humanity, because It's a grim fate, the second law of thermodynamics, that all knowledge disappear one day. And as one of the thermodynamics wrote actually in his death letter, if everything I know and everything that we've written, everything we've done as human beings is going to be dissolved one day, it might as well dissolve now. You can understand his point, but there is a way out of this. I think it's a good time here to terminate. I have to go to the loo, but I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon from this now very hot Palm House.
Thank you.